I knew something had shifted the moment my daughter did not save me a seat. It was my granddaughter's recital, the kind of evening that gets circled on calendars weeks in advance. The community center gym in BARRIE transformed with folding chairs and paper programs, and the particular hopeful smell of too many winter coats in one room. I had driven 40 minutes on the 400 in the dark, which I do not do lightly anymore since my eyes started complaining about headlights. I had told my daughter I was coming. She had said wonderful. She had said they would be there early to get good spots. They were there early. The spots they saved were for themselves. I found a chair near the back pillar, partially blocked by a sound system no one seemed to be using. I could see the stage if I leaned slightly to the left, which I did for the entire 40 minutes. My granddaughter was in the third row of the choir, second from the left, in a white blouse and a dark skirt, and when she spotted me between songs, she waved with both hands the way she has done since she was 4 years old. And I felt something tighten in my chest that had nothing to do with the pillar. After the recital, my daughter found me near the coat rack. She said, "Oh, you found a spot," as though I had chosen it. I drove home through the December dark and kept both hands on the wheel the way my husband had always reminded me to in winter. He had been gone for 6 years now, 6 years of me learning how to hold the wheel alone, how to come home to a house where the television was off, and the dog had been waiting since 4 in the afternoon. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment before going inside. The porch light was on. I had never learned to stop leaving it on. Inside, I made tea and stood at the kitchen counter and did not turn on any other lights for a while. I am 68 years old. I worked for 32 years as an office manager for a civil engineering firm in BARRIE, the kind of work that does not get mentioned at dinner parties but keeps an entire company from falling apart at the seams. I retired 4 years ago with a pension, a modest RRSP that I had been careful with for 2 decades, and a house on Cundall's Road that my husband and I bought in 1991 and which had appreciated in ways neither of us had thought to predict. We had not been wealthy people. We had been careful people, which is a different thing entirely and takes considerably more discipline. My daughter and her husband moved back to BARRIE from Calgary 3 years ago. I had been glad of it, or I thought I had. They had a daughter, my granddaughter, who was 9 at the time, and who had her grandfather's eyes and a directness that reminded me of no one on either side of the family. They moved into a house in a new subdivision off Mapleview, the kind of neighborhood where everything is the same shade of grage and the driveways are very clean. The mortgage was significant. My son-in-law worked in equipment leasing, and my daughter did administrative work part-time, and I understood without being told that the numbers were tight. I had helped. That is what I need you to understand about everything that came after. No one held a door shut and demanded anything. They simply mentioned, and I provided, and I told myself that was what family did when it had the means. $22,000 toward the down payment, because my daughter said they could not make the minimum without it, and her voice on the phone from Calgary had that thin quality that I recognized from when she was 17 and trying not to cry. 7 months of grocery transfers during a period when my son-in-law's commissions had dropped, and the hydro bill and the daycare fees were, she said, simply too much all at once. My granddaughter's skating lessons, 3 years of them, because my daughter had mentioned offhand that they could not quite swing the registration, and my granddaughter had so wanted to learn, and I had wanted her to learn, and some expenses feel less like expenses and more like love. I kept a folder in the bottom drawer of my desk. Nurse's document, office manager's document. I had learned, in 32 years of keeping other people organized, that a record is not a grievance. It is simply the truth. Written down somewhere, it will not be misremembered. The folder had everything in it: transfers, dates, amounts, the emails where my daughter had asked, and the ones where I had confirmed. I had not opened it in 8 months. That December night after the recital, I opened it, and I read it the way you read something you have been avoiding, carefully and without flinching. The total was not the point. The total was just a number. What I was reading underneath the number was the story of how I had never once been thanked in a way that acknowledged what the giving had cost. Not ungratefully received, exactly. Just received, the way you receive something you have decided belongs to you. Near the back of the folder was an envelope I had placed there 6 weeks earlier and not opened since. It had arrived in my regular mail on a Tuesday, forwarded from a return address I did not recognize. A financial services company in Mississauga. Inside was a document I recognized the shape of before I finished reading the first paragraph. It was an inquiry about establishing a power of attorney for property. Not my power of attorney, not something I had requested or discussed or been consulted about. An inquiry, exploratory in tone, about the process of establishing oversight for the financial affairs of an aging parent who might, the cover letter said, benefit from assistance managing her assets. My daughter had requested information about taking control of my finances. Without telling me, without asking me, without a single conversation across any table at any time. I set the paper down on the desk and looked at the window for a long time. Outside, the street was quiet in the way that Barrie gets quiet in December. A snowplow, moving somewhere in the middle distance, the orange glow of it against the low cloud. I was not angry. That surprised me. Anger would have been easier, cleaner, something to burn through and be done with. What I felt instead was a cold, useful clarity, the kind that arrives when you finally stop telling yourself a story that has not been true for some time. I closed the folder and went to bed. I did not sleep for a long time. The house settled and creaked around me the way that houses do in the cold, and I lay in the dark and thought about every decision I had made freely, and every decision I had made because no one left me another option. By 5 in the morning I was dressed and sitting at the kitchen table with my tea and the folder, and all the quiet I needed. I drove to my bank when it opened. I had been with the same branch on Dunlop Street for 23 years, and the branch manager that morning was a woman named Christine, who had handled my accounts since before my husband died. She was organized and direct, and she had never once spoken to me the way some people at financial institutions speak to women my age, as though confusion is simply waiting to arrive and they are prepared to manage it. I sat across from her and I told her what I needed. The monthly e-transfers that had been going to my daughter's household account, I wanted them stopped. The credit card I held on which my daughter was listed as an authorized user, I wanted her removed immediately. The joint savings account that my son-in-law had been added to 2 years earlier, an arrangement I had agreed to because my daughter said it made it easier for them to manage contributions to my granddaughter's RESP. I wanted that separated. My funds moved, my name alone. Christine worked through each item without flinching. She asked me once if I was certain, and I told her I was. She nodded with the particular professionalism of someone who understands that her job is to execute a decision, not evaluate the person making it. Then she paused. She turned her monitor slightly toward me. There was a notification flagged on the screen from 2 days prior. Someone had attempted to access my online banking profile at 6:43 in the morning. The attempt had failed because of a new security question Christine's branch had implemented last quarter. The person who had tried had answered my security questions incorrectly on the second attempt, and the account had locked. I thought about the notepad in my desk drawer, the one where 2 years ago my daughter had asked me to write down my banking password in case something ever happened and she needed to act quickly on my behalf. I had thought that was love asking. I understood now it was something else. I said, change everything. Every password, every security question, every contact number, and recovery email. Before I leave this branch, Christine's expression did not change. She turned back to her keyboard, and her fingers moved with a steadiness that I found genuinely calming. We worked through every account I held at that institution. Each confirmation felt less like paperwork and more like a door with a new lock on it. When we finished, I thanked her and stood, and my knees reminded me, as they had started doing 2 years ago, that I was not 45 anymore. The morning outside was gray and cold, with the particular flat light of a December day that has decided against any drama. I walked to my car and sat in the driver's seat for a moment. I had spent 32 years managing the operational details of a company where decisions had to be made quickly, accurately, and without the luxury of waiting until you felt ready. I had learned that readiness is mostly a story you tell yourself to avoid action. I knew how to act. I drove next to my lawyer's office on Bradford Street. His name was Jeffrey, and he was the kind of lawyer who had been practicing long enough to have stopped being surprised by the things people did to one another inside families. He rose when I came in, shook my hand, and asked his assistant to hold his morning. I told him I needed to revise my will completely. He listened. He did not interrupt. When I finished, he asked me one question. He asked whether I had thought carefully about this or whether I was responding to something that had happened recently. I said it was both, and that at 68 I had learned those two things were not mutually exclusive, and in fact usually arrived together. He accepted that, and we began. My primary assets were the house on Cundall's Road, which was mortgage-free and had a current assessed value that I had not thought about too carefully, because thinking about it had always felt like counting something that wasn't finished yet. My RRSP, which I had rolled into a RRIF the previous year, and which my financial advisor had confirmed, was in reasonable shape for my expected needs, and a small non-registered investment account that had grown quietly and without fanfare over a long time. The kind of thing that does not make you rich, but keeps you from becoming dependent. I removed my daughter and her husband from all of it. Everything that remained would go into a trust for my granddaughter, to be managed by a trustee independent of her parents until she turned 25. Jeffrey drafted it clearly. Each document I signed with the steadiness of someone who had decided not to wait for the feeling to pass. Then Jeffrey said something that made me set down my pen. He looked at a note he had flagged in my file from several weeks earlier, something he had not yet raised because he had not known how to approach it. My son-in-law had called his office in November, asking about the legal process for seeking guardianship over a parent who might be experiencing cognitive difficulties. He had not called to inform me. He had not raised a concern with me at dinner or on the phone. He had called my lawyer and asked how to have me declared incapable of managing my own affairs. And then, on the Saturday after that phone call, he had brought my granddaughter to visit and sat in my living room and told me and eaten my shortbread and told me about the renovation they were planning for the downstairs bathroom. The room did not move. I picked up my pen. "Let's finish," I said. Jeffrey worked until every document was complete and filed, and I held copies of all of it. I left his office at 11:30 and drove home through the kind of midday BARRIE traffic that asks just enough of your attention to quiet everything else. That was useful. I did not need thoughts. I needed lunch and my own walls and the dog who had been waiting since morning and was deeply uninterested in the details of the morning and simply wanted her walk. I had barely unclipped her leash when my phone began. A text from my daughter. "Something is wrong with the card. It just declined at Canadian Tire. Can you call the bank?" Then a call I let go to voicemail. Then another text. "I had a hair appointment and it was declined too. There must be a technical issue. Please call me back when you get this." Then a text from my son-in-law. "Hey, just flagging that the joint account looks different. Probably a system thing. Let me know when you're free." The phrase "let me know when you're free." As though I were still the administrative support structure of their lives, available to troubleshoot inconveniences at short notice. I made soup from the leftover roasted vegetables in the refrigerator. I ate at the kitchen table and watched a chickadee on the feeder outside the window. The dog slept under my chair. By 2 in the afternoon, my daughter's car was in the driveway. I watched from the front window. She sat inside the car for a few minutes. My son-in-law got out first and walked up the front path with the particular energy of a man who has prepared several things to say. My daughter followed. Her face was controlled in the way it gets when she has decided to lead with calm and keep the frustration underneath it. She knocked. I stayed where I was for a moment. She knocked again. "Mom, your car is here. Please open the door." I set my soup bowl in the sink and folded the dish towel over the oven handle and walked to the front door and opened it. They both looked at me with the expression people use when they are deciding between several approaches. My son-in-law settled on the practical one. "There's something wrong with all the cards," he said. "And the joint account is showing only your name now. We think there might have been some kind of fraud alert. Can you call Christine and sort it out today because our mortgage payment comes out on the 15th. I looked at him for a moment, and then I said, "Come inside if you want to talk." My daughter came into my living room and stood near the bookcase with her arms crossed in the way she has done since she was a teenager, and was not yet sure whether to push or to retreat. My son-in-law stood near the door. He had his phone in his hand, and he was not looking at it, which told me he was more unsettled than he wanted to appear. He said, "I was on a call with a client when the card declined. Do you understand what that looks like?" I sat in my chair by the window, the one I have had since my husband was alive, the one he called your thinking chair, even when I was just sitting in it, because he understood that sitting and thinking were the same activity for me. "I understand exactly what it looks like," I said. My daughter uncrossed her arms. "Mom, we're not trying to make your life difficult. We've had a hard year. You know that. The things you've helped with, you offered." I thought about the power of attorney inquiry sitting in my folder in the desk drawer. I thought about Jeffrey's note about the guardianship call in November. I thought about the failed login at 6:43 in the morning. I said, When were either of you planning to tell me about the power of attorney paperwork? They looked at each other. That particular look that married people exchange when they are recalibrating. I had been in enough rooms with enough people in difficult situations to understand what that look meant. It meant the conversation they had rehearsed on the way over was not the conversation they were now having. My daughter spoke first. That was just research. We were worried about you. You've been alone for 6 years, and we thought it would be responsible to understand the options. I said, and the call to my lawyer in November? The one about guardianship? My son-in-law's expression shifted. He looked at my daughter. She looked at the floor. The word I had not expected to come to me was grief. Not anger, not righteousness. Grief for the specific version of my daughter I had believed I knew, the one I had driven through December dark to watch stand in a gym full of folding chairs, the one I had written checks for and transferred money to and offered my home to after Calgary, the one I had believed was tired and overwhelmed and simply needed time to find her footing. I thought about what I wanted to say. I had had since 5 in the morning to think about it, and I did not need long. I said, I know what you were planning. I know about the power of attorney. I know about the call to my lawyer. I know that someone with my old password attempted to access my primary account on Wednesday morning before I had reached the bank. I've known for a while that you had started to see my life as something to be managed. What I didn't know until recently was how long I had been letting it happen. My daughter's voice went very quiet. You're making it sound like we're criminals. I let that word sit in the air for a moment. The front door, which my son-in-law had not fully closed behind him, pushed open, and my granddaughter stepped inside. She was still in her school things, her backpack on, her winter boots unzipped at the ankle, the way she always wore them when she came from the bus. She had clearly walked from the corner rather than waiting for one of them to come back for her. My daughter said her name in a warning tone. My granddaughter looked at her mother and then looked at me. She came to stand near my chair, and her voice was lower than usual, but she had not yet learned how to calibrate what she intended for only one person to hear. Grandma, she said, I heard them talking on the phone this morning before school. They said if you wouldn't cooperate, there were legal things they could do. They said the house would need to be dealt with. She paused. I thought you should know, she said. The room held very still. My son-in-law had gone the color of something unwell. My daughter looked at her daughter with an expression I could not fully read, part fury, part something she would not want named in front of me. My granddaughter looked at me with the clear-eyed patience she had been practicing since she was old enough to understand that adults sometimes need to be waited out. I put my hand over hers for a moment. Thank you, sweetheart. What followed was loud in the way these things always are when they have been building for a long time. My son-in-law said I had misread the situation. My daughter said she had only ever wanted to protect me, that she had been worried that no one seemed to understand how much pressure they had been under. My son-in-law said the money had never been demanded, that I had given it freely, which was true and which was not the point. I let them finish. Then I said, I know exactly what I gave and why I gave it. I know what was attempted on my account on Wednesday. I know about the guardianship inquiry. I know about the power of attorney research. The accounts are changed. The cards are closed. The will has been revised. What happens next is a decision you'll have to make on your own. My daughter made a sound I had not heard from her since she was a child, something between anger and the beginning of something else, and then she turned and walked out the front door. Her footsteps on the porch boards were harder than they needed to be. My son-in-law stood in my living room for another moment. He was looking at the floor. He was wearing the expression of someone who has heard himself described accurately for the first time and does not yet know what to do with it. He left without saying anything else. My granddaughter stayed. She sat down on the couch and pulled her backpack onto her lap and looked at the quilt, on the back of the sofa, the one my husband's mother had made and sent from Cape Breton the winter after we were married. She had been 12 for 3 weeks. She said, "I'm sorry they do this." I looked at my granddaughter and felt something move through me that was specific and complete. The particular tenderness of watching someone very young understand something that takes most people much longer. "You have nothing to be sorry for," I said. She looked at the quilt. "I just think you've always done everything for us," she said. "And I don't think they notice." "Noticing," I said, "is the most important thing. Don't lose that." I drove her home 20 minutes later because her parents had gone without her. She kissed my cheek at the door and went inside. I sat at the curb for a moment. Down the street, their house glowed with all the lights on, the way it always was, the warm, expensive look of a house where someone was not thinking about the hydro bill. I drove home to fewer lights and better quiet. The days after that were the quietest I had known in years. No texts arriving at odd hours with a casual opening line that moved within 2 exchanges to a specific financial need. No calls that began with "How are you?" and meant something else entirely. My phone sat on the counter and I cooked for myself and walked the dog in the mornings at a pace that was mine alone to decide. I slept through the nights in a way I had not for longer than I had realized until I did. On the 4th morning there was a knock at the door before 9. Tentative. Not the knock of someone who expects the door to simply open because they have arrived. My daughter stood on the porch in clothes that looked like she had not thought about what she put on. No coat, which meant she had driven from around the corner and had not planned on staying long. Her hair was down. She looked like she had not been sleeping. She said, "Mom, can I come in?" And then she said, "I'm not here to ask for anything. I just need to talk to you." I stepped back. She sat on the couch and did not take the center of it, which she always took when she felt confident. She sat to one side with her hands in her lap and looked at the quilt for a moment. Then she said, "I keep thinking about the recital. When I didn't save you a seat." She paused. "I think I've been telling myself for a long time that you're fine, that you don't need anything, that you're capable and you have your pension and your house and you're managing. And somewhere underneath that, I think I was using it as permission not to show up for you the way I should." She stopped. The dog wandered in from the kitchen and put her head on my daughter's knee, which the dog does for people when she has assessed them and found something worth offering. I listened. She said, "I think somewhere in the last few years I stopped seeing you and started seeing the situation, the house and the accounts, and what it all meant for us. And I let him talk me into things I knew were wrong because I was scared about money and I'm tired, and that's not an excuse. I know it's not an excuse." She did not cry. I did not need her to. She said, "I'm ashamed of what we were planning. I'm ashamed that Nora had to be the one to say it out loud." Said, "Nora knew because Nora pays attention. That is not a small thing." My daughter nodded. She sat with it. She did not ask me to reverse the financial changes. She did not mention the accounts or the will. She said she was sorry in the plain way, without conditions attached to the end of it, and I accepted it the way you accept the beginning, of something that will take time to become what it is supposed to become. I told her that love had never been the question, that I had loved her since the morning she was born, and that had not changed and would not change. But that love had never been the same as unlimited access, and I should have said so many years ago, and some of what had happened was a consequence of my own silence. She looked up at that. I said, "We both have things to do differently. That's not an accusation, it's just the truth." She left after an hour. On the porch, she turned back and said, "Nora asked if she could call you more, just to talk." I smiled. She can call me whenever she likes. My daughter nodded and walked to her car. I stood at the door until she had driven away, and then I closed it and went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. The morning after that I woke before 6, the way I used to, on working days, the body keeping its schedules long after the reasons for them are gone. I lay in the dark and took stock of myself, which is a habit I developed somewhere in my 40s and have not seen a reason to stop. I was 68 years old. I lived alone in a house that belonged entirely to me, on a street I had lived on for 31 years, in a city that knew how to be cold without apologizing for it. I had a pension that arrived on the last business day of every month and accounts that no one else could access, and a will that said precisely what I intended it to say. I had a granddaughter who texted me good morning, and a daughter who was, for what felt like the first time in several years, beginning to understand the difference between family and a resource. I got up and made tea and stood at the kitchen window while it steeped. Outside, the yard was gray and white with the particular stillness of a December morning before the neighborhood wakes. The old spruce in the back corner, the one my husband planted, the year we moved in because he said every yard needed something that would outlast the people in it, stood exactly where it had always stood. It had been through a great deal of weather. It was not interested in being managed. My phone lit up on the counter. My granddaughter. "Good morning, Grandma. Thinking of you." I picked it up and typed back. "Good morning, sweetheart. I'm thinking of you too." She sent a small red maple leaf, seasonal and entirely her. I poured my tea and carried it to the front porch and stood in the cold for a moment. The street was quiet. A neighbor from 4 houses down was scraping his windshield in his driveway, the particular rhythmic sound of a Canadian winter morning, steady and unhurried and completely ordinary. I had spent a long time believing that generosity was the price of being loved, that a mother who protected her own resources was a mother who loved less, held back, had drawn a line where a line should not be. I had given past the point of comfort because discomfort had felt like proof of love. And comfort had felt like selfishness, and somewhere in the arithmetic of that I had lost track of my own needs so completely that I had stopped noticing they existed. But standing there in the cold with my tea going cool in my hands, and the spruce in the back corner, and Nora's maple leaf still on my phone screen, I understood something I had been circling for a long time. A boundary is not a wall. It is not the end of love. It is the shape of a life that has decided it deserves to continue on its own terms, to take up its own space, to exist without apology or justification, or the constant management of other people's comfort at the expense of its own. I was 68 years old, and I was healthy, and I had money in accounts that no one else could touch, and a granddaughter who sent me maple leaves in the morning, and a daughter who was, slowly and with difficulty, learning what it meant to show up rather than simply arrive. I had a house that was paid for, and a dog that loved me without conditions, and a street I had walked on for 31 years and knew by heart. I had a chair by the window and a kettle I put on when I needed to think, and a spruce tree my husband planted that had no intention of going anywhere. The morning moved around me, cold and quiet and entirely my own. I had spent so many years organizing my days around what other people needed from me. All the small adjustments and the large ones, all the ways I had made myself available and accessible and easy to ask. I had told myself that being needed was the same as being valued. It had taken me an embarrassingly long time to understand that those were two entirely different things, and that the one I had been mistaking for the other was the lesser of the two by a considerable distance. I did not want to be needed the way I had been needed. I wanted to be loved. Truly, without a budget attached to it. I went back inside and washed my cup and opened the kitchen window just enough to let the cold air move through, the way I had always liked it, the way my husband used to ask me not to do because he ran cold and I ran warm, and that was one of the 1,000 small negotiations that make up a marriage. I sat at the kitchen table with the quiet around me and the spruce in the yard and the whole unhurried morning ahead. I had no transfers to make that were not my own. No calls to anticipate from people who loved me in the particular way that always seemed to come with a number attached. No appointments to manage on behalf of people who were old enough to manage their own. Just the morning and the tea and the life I had spent 68 years building and had only just decided to live as though it belonged to me. It did. It always had. I had simply forgotten, for a while, to act like it.